At the beginning of 2025, Vladimir Putin thought he had everything in place to strip Ukraine of the support of NATO, or at least of NATO's dominant member, the United States. US President Donald Trump was hinting at the US leaving NATO. At various points, he put the blame on Ukraine for starting the war with Russia. Everything was going according to Putin's plan. What a difference 9.5 months have made. Putin's refusal to agree to peace terms has led the US right back into the NATO fold, and now NATO is going all in for Ukraine. Russia won't survive what's coming, as Ukraine is going to get everything it needs to fight back. On October 15th, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte spoke at a press conference following the NATO-Ukraine Council. There, Rutte told assembled journalists that over half of NATO's members have agreed to support the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PURL, program that has been designed to funnel support into Ukraine. Under this program, NATO allies provide the money, which Ukraine can then use to purchase specific US-made weapons that Ukraine believes it needs to do maximum damage to Putin's invading forces. That simple tweak to military aid makes a huge difference for Ukraine. Although restrictions obviously apply, the US isn't going to start selling F-35s to Ukraine anytime soon, for instance. PURL means that Ukraine is no longer reliant on its allies providing whatever they have to spare. Instead, Ukraine gets to pick and choose what it wants, with PURL allowing NATO allies to put money into a collective cash pot that Ukraine dips into as needed. Back to Rutte, he told journalists that the number of NATO allies contributing to PURL has risen from 6 to over half. NATO has 32 member nations, which means that more than 16 are now taking part in the program. The catch here is that Rutte didn't mention the NATO members taking part by name. However, perhaps he didn't need to. Several NATO nations have already announced their intention to contribute to PURL before Rutte's announcement. Also on October 15th, NATO's two newest members, Finland and Sweden, announced that they are happy to buy US weapons under the PURL program to support Ukraine. Both countries joined NATO during the Ukraine war, each ending decades of relative neutrality in the process, and they're now looking to do everything they can to help Ukraine keep Russia at bay. ABC News reports on comments made by key ministers in the Finnish and Swedish administrations. Antti Häkkänen, who is Finland's defense minister, said that Finland had decided to join the PURL because we see that it's crucial that Ukraine gets the critical US weapons. Interestingly, Häkkänen also noted that Finland will be providing military aid separate from PURL as well, meaning Ukraine will soon benefit from some Finnish weapons, along with those it can buy from the US thanks to Finland. Häkkänen's Swedish counterpart, Pål Jonson, echoed the Finnish defense minister's comments. This is critical now because we've been seeing the wrong trajectory when it comes to support for Ukraine, that it's been going down and we want to see more stepping up, Jonson added. Sweden's defense minister is referencing recent reports that military aid to Ukraine has declined substantially, which we'll cover in greater detail later in the video. So Finland and Sweden are among the 16+. There are several other confirmed contributors, as Newsweek notes in its report on Rutte's PURL announcement. The outlet reports that Ukraine itself has revealed several other PURL contributors, including Iceland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They're going to be contributing to the upcoming 5th and 6th PURL packages delivered to Ukraine. These are all new members, as you will discover in a moment. However, you may notice that we're seeing a distinct lack of several of Europe's major military powers, such as France, Germany, and the UK. Of those three, Germany is a contributor. Back in August, the country announced that it would fund a $500 million PURL package for Ukraine, making it one of the program's earliest contributors. That also suggests that at least one of the 6 nations we just mentioned isn't one of the original 6, and is instead among the expanded 16+. As for France and the UK, which are NATO's 2 other nuclear powers outside of the US, neither had contributed to PURL yet. We may about to see that change if they're among the 16+ that Rutte mentions. As for the original 6 that Rutte mentioned, we've already covered Germany. Other past contributors to PURL include the Netherlands, which was the trailblazer in the program. It contributed $578 million to create the first PURL package. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway combined forces to offer $495 million for the second package. Germany's $500 million was a third package, with Canada rounding out the original 6 with its own $500 million donation. That's a little over $2 billion contributed by 6 nations. With almost triple that number now part of PURL, Ukraine will be hoping for several billion more. Of course, the US is part of PURL in the sense that it provides the weapons purchased via PURL. However, it doesn't seem to have spent any of its own money on those weapons, at least as part of the program. US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, who was formerly the Defense Secretary before rebranding, has also suggested that the expansion of PURL could mean very big things for the Ukraine war. Our expectation today is that more countries donate even more, that they purchase even more to provide for Ukraine to bring that conflict to a peaceful conclusion, Newsweek reports Hegseth as stating. This seems to align with the peace-through-strength approach that Hegseth typically favors. If all goes well with the expanded PURL, Ukraine is about to receive a lot of power. That leads us to what systems are likely to be procured by Ukraine thanks to PURL's new contributors. There isn't a concrete answer to that question, though we can make some assumptions based on the types of weapons that Ukraine has said it needs more of in the past. We know that previous PURL contributions have enabled Ukraine to get its hands on interceptor missiles it can use in its Patriot air defense systems, along with missiles it can fire from its HIMARS. Perhaps more contributions will lead to additional purchases of these missiles, with the systems needed to fire them. However, there are other weapons that Ukraine needs. The country's defense minister, Denis Shmyhal, outlined what they were in a Facebook post published on October 15th in the wake of Rutte's announcement. In addition to thanking the new PURL contributors, Shmyhal mentioned air defense munitions, though for systems other than the two that we've mentioned. This winter, we will urgently need interceptors, air defense systems, and surface-to-air anti-aircraft missiles for NASAMS, IRIS-T systems, F-16 aircraft, and more, Ukraine's defense minister notes. Winter is only a month and a half away. Perhaps this comment alone shows us where any new influx of PURL cash is going to go. Beyond that, Shmyhal also noted that Ukraine needs more investment into its growing drone army, and as many artillery systems and shells as it can get its hands on. We continue to insist on a primary need of more than $4 billion. In 2026, we will be able to produce 20 million drones if partners provide the necessary funding. Our deep strike drones and missiles help us respond asymmetrically to Russian strikes, Shmyhal noted in his Facebook post. He raises an interesting point. Ukraine's capacity for building drones and the actual number of drones it manufactures annually aren't the same. Ukraine can build more than it's building right now, but it doesn't have the funds to do so. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky made a similar point back in June. Business Insider reports that Zelensky believes his country has the ability to build 8 million drones per year if it manages to get its hands on more funding. There's a contradiction in numbers here. Zelensky says 8 million per year, while Shmyhal says 20 million. However, Ukraine's defense minister doesn't say it will build 20 million drones annually, so perhaps he's offering a figure that Ukraine can build over several years. Either way, the message is the same. PURL could help Ukraine to build more drones, perhaps with US help. As for artillery, Shmyhal simply states that Ukraine needs more long-range artillery shells. As an interesting postscript to his comments, Ukraine's defense minister adds that the country's European allies have ways to contribute outside of PURL, and that such contributions will play a huge role in aiding Ukraine. We ask partners to join us in covering $60 billion, half of planned spending. The optimal way is for European partners to allocate at least 0.25% of GDP to military assistance for Ukraine. Another option is a loan financed from Russia's frozen assets, Shmyhal said before concluding his post with another thank you to the NATO nations that have now added their strength to PURL. To some, this final request could seem greedy. However, it makes sense in the context of Ukraine growing its domestic defense industry. As of September, almost 60% of the weapons Ukraine is using in its war against Russia are soldiers and other equipment. Shmyhal may be asking NATO's European members to look toward the future here. Aiding Ukraine now with its ballooning defense budget could be seen as an investment. If Ukraine succeeds against Russia, it will do so partially because it has a much larger defense industry that could then go on to supply its European allies in the years after the war. Invest to defeat Russia now, benefit from even stronger collective defense against Russian aggression in the future. There is one potential PURL weapon that we haven't mentioned yet, a weapon that has been on many people's minds because there's been many hints that the US could start supplying them to Ukraine as punishment for Putin's refusal to agree to peace terms. According to RBC Ukraine, it's a weapon upon which Trump has said a decision has effectively already been made. It's also a weapon that has led to the Kremlin crying out that its introduction into the war would be a major blow to the relationship between the US and Russia. That weapon is Tomahawk missiles. And as a US-made weapon, Ukraine could theoretically purchase these missiles via the PURL program, assuming the US gives it permission to do so. Right now, no final decision has been made, though there is quiet confidence in some quarters that the US is going to give the green light. Publicly, Trump's comments have been all maybes and I may, but if RBC Ukraine is to be believed, the decision is practically made, and Russia's reaction, combined with comments made by Zelensky that the arrival of Tomahawks would force Russia to sober up, suggests that the decision has gone in Ukraine's favor. If it has, Tomahawks could be a game changer, especially in terms of effectiveness of Ukraine's long-range campaign against Russia's energy infrastructure. These powerful missiles are capable of traveling up to 1,500 miles, the BBC reports, That would put Moscow within firing range should Ukraine decide to directly engage Russia's capital. There are also versatile missiles that can be launched from ships, submarines, or land, though the former two options likely don't apply to Ukraine, given the limited strength of its navy. Still, at roughly $2.5 million per missile, for the most recent version, per the New York Times, Tomahawks would be an affordable addition to PURL, especially now that the program has more than 16 members. We'll have to wait and see what the US ultimately decides when it comes to these missiles. Even if Ukraine doesn't end up getting more Tomahawks, Rutte's announcement means that it's got something that it's been wanting since PURL was created: more members. Hours prior to the Ukraine-NATO Council that led to the announcement of new PURL members, the Kyiv Post published a report stating that Rutte intended to press NATO allies to join the initiative during the meeting. And one of the issues we'll be discussing is the new program, which we launched only in August, the program where the United States is again delivering essential, lethal and non-lethal military support to Ukraine, paid for by allies, already $2 billion committed in the build-up to the Council. And I have every reason to assume today that many other countries will sign up. Rutte was right. PURL now has more than 16 contributors, and the odds are that other NATO members will join the program when they're able. If Europe's heavy hitters, such as France and the UK, bring their weight to the initiative, Russia will be terrified. It may not even survive what comes after. For now, let's explore what all of this means for the war. The expansion of PURL is great for Ukraine from the perspective that the program's existence puts to bed the issues that Trump and his administration have had with NATO in the very recent past. After all, it was only during Trump's 2018 visit to the NATO summit in Brussels that the US made it very clear that he was no supporter of the way NATO was being run at the time. As Politico reports, Trump's first term saw him threaten to withdraw the US from NATO entirely unless the rest of the organization's members started spending more to contribute to collective defense. Trump had a point. The US remains the biggest defense spender in NATO even in 2025. However, the gulf between its spending and the rest of NATO's spending was massive until very recently. That's highlighted by a July 2024 article from the Atlantic Council, which reveals barely any of NATO's members were hitting the organization's target of 2% of gross domestic product, or GDP, spent on defense a year before Putin invaded Ukraine. Poland, the US, Greece, and Latvia were the only members at or above 2%, with Lithuania being right on the edge. Everybody else was well below the mark, and Trump was angry about it. Trump's push for more NATO spending continued in his second term, which began in 2025. By that point, the Atlantic Council notes, 23 of NATO's member nations were hitting or exceeding the 2% GDP target. But Trump wanted more, and he got it. As of August 27th, NATO has officially announced that it will be setting a new target of 5% of each member's GDP being committed to defense. With the US under Trump seemingly satisfied that spending is fair in NATO once again, it seems happier to work alongside the organization to support Ukraine once more. PURL is the most prominent way the US is doing so. For Putin, the US coming back into the NATO fold is terrible news. For much of 2025, Putin appeared to believe that he could sow the seeds of division within NATO to the point that the organization would become a non-factor in Ukraine. Building a closer relationship with the US, which could have allowed Putin to drip honey into Trump's ear and convince him that exiting NATO was the right call, seemed to be part of the plan. But Putin overplayed his hand in peace negotiations, with Rutte's new announcement showing Putin that NATO is now united against Russia's aggression in Ukraine. The US, as an individual nation, also seems to be behind Ukraine to an extent that it hasn't been at any other point during Trump's second tenure as president. In recent months, Trump has been threatening sanctions against Russia, albeit without following through. The Tomahawk issue we mentioned earlier is another example of the US using its considerable influence to try to bring Putin back to the negotiating table. The US knows that Russia doesn't want Ukraine to have Tomahawk missiles, and it's using that fact as leverage. America's threats against Russia, which translate into support for Ukraine, were even being made on the day that Rutte announced the PURL expansion. In the same speech in which he expressed his support for PURL and pushed NATO's European members to spend more, Hegseth said that the US was prepared to impose costs on Russia for its continued aggression if the war doesn't end. All of this will be music to Ukraine's collective ears. Having such direct support from the US, solidified in a program like PURL, means it no longer has to worry about the ups and downs that characterized its relationship with America during the first half of 2025. Still, there are issues to overcome. Some will point out that PURL is a program that benefits the US, even as it supports Ukraine. They will be right to an extent. Under PURL, the US is essentially getting paid to send weapons to Ukraine, with that money coming from Ukraine's European allies. This is a sort of compromise, enabling the US to send the advanced weapons that Russia fears most without having to dip its hand into its own pocket. That sounds like a pretty good deal for the US. And for NATO, it's at least a deal that strengthens the relationship of its members to a country that once seemed to be on the verge of withdrawing from the organization. The other issue is that even with PURL, Ukraine needs more money. Mial made that clear in his Facebook post, and it's a fact that Ukraine has been receiving less military aid this summer than at any other point during 2025. The Kyiv Institute, which tracks how much aid is delivered to Ukraine, made that point in an October 14th article. It noted that the months of July and August saw a sharp 43% decline in military aid compared to the first half of 2025. Civilian aid remains high, the outlet says. A possible cause for this is that Europe's NATO members have burned through their stockpiles of reserve equipment, making it harder for them to provide more when they're also trying to maintain their own strength. Whatever the case may be, military aid has been down. PURL will go some way toward alleviating that issue, and with over 16 contributors, Ukraine is looking at a future where the specific US weapons it needs to tackle Russia are within its grasp. None of this has gone according to Putin's plan. But what is going according to plan, at least according to the Kremlin, is the catastrophic losses Russia is experiencing in Ukraine. Find out what those losses are and why Russia seems so happy to accept them in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the latest moves that NATO makes against Russia. And thank you as always for watching.